Hello, welcome back to my channel. You're going to see me change halfway through. My entire appearance and the background is going to change because this video took quite a long time because there is so much. It's a very long story and there's a lot of things I had to sift through to try to find the truth, although it's still very muddled and messy of what actually happened and who was the victim and stuff like that. So anyways, today I just recently watched Dirty John season 2 because I really enjoyed season 1, and in season 2 they sort of fictionalized the case of Betty Broderick. So I did my own research into the case and I'm going to tell you the true story of Betty Broderick. So if you like true crime and commentary videos, please subscribe because I did a lot of research for this. Thanks. Let's get into it. The murder Betty Broderick committed back in 1989 became huge news and resulted in a media frenzy. The frenzy has been reignited a bit in 2020 because of the season 2 premiere of Dirty John, which focuses on the Betty Broderick story. It's a semi-fictional, but from my research and watching, it's pretty accurate to the case. So I thought I'd recount the true story of what happened to Betty Broderick and why she committed the murder of her ex-husband and his new young wife. Elizabeth Ann Broderick, also known as Betty for short, was born on November 7th, 1947 in East Chester, New York. More specifically, she was raised in a suburb located in East Chester called Bronxville by her two parents, Marita, and Frank. Today, Bronxville is a very expensive upper-class suburb. The average cost or the median cost to purchase a house in Bronxville is $2.33 million, or it was back in 2016. The prices have probably raised. I think it was more of a middle-class suburb when Betty was growing up in Bronxville, as her family was just the average middle-class American family. Although at the time, Bronxville was known for being actively against Jewish residents throughout the 1950s, and they would actually refuse to rent to Jewish individuals. This obviously didn't affect Betty's family because her parents were strict Roman Catholics and they raised their children to be such as well. She was the third of 6 total children that her parents had together. Her siblings were Marita, Francis, Claire, Gerard, and Michael. Her father was Italian and her mother was Irish. Betty's paternal grandfather founded a plastering company in 1908 called the Baseglia of Plastering Corporation. I apologize, I can't pronounce anything. Betty's parents both worked in this family business as they were raising their children, and her father eventually became the president of the business before retiring in 1980. It is alleged that Betty's parents were sort of the quintessential 1950s strict Catholic parents. There was very high expectations for Betty and her siblings to follow the rules and the commandments of the church while also doing well in school. And then Betty, as a female, was taught either overtly or covertly that her ultimate goal in life or ultimate dream should be to become a housewife and to find a man who would work and she would stay at home with the kids. Later on in her life, Betty would sort of say this was her parents trying to program her to become a housewife. She said her upbringing was like, quote, "Go to Catholic schools, be careful with dating until you find a Catholic man, support him while he works, and be blessed in your later years with beautiful grandchildren." I think this alleged programming gives you sort of a context as to why Betty's mental health deteriorated the way it did after her eventual divorce. She was expected and raised to sort of dedicate her entire life to a man and her family. In 1965, Betty graduated from Maria Regina High School, which was eventually the same year that she met her soon-to-be husband. Afterwards, she attended the College of Mount St. Vincent, which was located in the Bronx, and I believe it's an all-girls college. Betty took an accelerated program for early childhood education with a minor in English. So going back in time a little bit, as I said, Betty met her soon-to-be husband, or her eventual husband, in 1965 when she attended an after party after a football game at the University of Notre Dame. At this time, I think she was 17 turning 18, and her eventual husband was 3 or 4 years older, so 21, 22. Betty was at the University of Notre Dame visiting one of her girlfriends, and reportedly this was the first time her parents had let her go and visit one of her friends for a weekend, but I do believe she was chaperoned by a brother or someone. Betty later admitted that she wasn't initially attracted to her husband, soon-to-be husband, and said, quote, "He had long skinny sideburns and round tortoiseshell glasses, and she called him a geek." Daniel T. Broderick III, also known as Dan, which is what I'm going to be referring to him as, was born on November 24th, 1944 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It seems that both Betty and Dan had pretty similar upbringings. He was one of 9 children born to his parents. I believe it was 5 girls, 4 boys. His parents were both Irish Catholic and were strict in a similar way to Betty's parents. His parents also put a large emphasis on education, and I believe all of his 9 siblings actually went to post-secondary school or on to college or university. Actually, all 4 boys attended the University of Notre Dame, which Dan was the first to attend. Dan was the eldest brother, and later on in life, his younger brother, Larry Broderick, said that Dan was the smartest out of all the siblings. When the pair first met in 1965, Dan was in his senior year at the University of Notre Dame. I believe he was in a pre-med program, whereas Betty was a freshman at her respective college. Dan introduced himself to Betty at the football game after party by giving her a napkin on which he had written Daniel T. Broderick III, MDA. When Betty asked him what MDA stood for, he said medical doctor almost. As I mentioned, Betty said she wasn't immediately attracted to Dan, but she quickly changed her tune when Dan went out of his way to stay in contact with her by mailing her letters. The two noticed that they had a lot in common. Betty said they were both ambitious and funny. In the fall of 1966, Dan moved to Manhattan to study medicine at the University of Cornell. Because they were so much closer and they were both now located in New York, the two began dating and seeing each other pretty frequently. On the weekends, Dan would go to Betty and the two would go out on dates. To me, researching and looking back on it, Dan's main motivator for becoming a doctor seemed to be money. He was pretty middle class growing up, but he wanted to be sort of upper class wealthy. That seems to be his main motivator in all his careers, as you'll see. They even shared a favorite song, which was Until the 12th of Never by Johnny Mathis. Betty told Dan that her main dream in life was to become a mother, and Dan agreed and said that their dreams and paths aligned. Together, they wanted to achieve wealth, high status, and raise a large family together. I'm unsure of the exact date or the manner of how Dan proposed to Betty, but they had a pretty lavish wedding and they were married at a church that was close to Betty's childhood home called Immaculate Conception Church. For their honeymoon, the couple went on a Caribbean cruise and then stayed with friends in St. Thomas. They conceived their first child, Kim, sometime during their honeymoon. Later on, Betty would say that this is when she noticed an immediate change, basically right after the wedding day, when they were in St. Thomas, staying at an apartment or a hotel sort of thing, Dan told the maids that worked there not to come in and clean the apartment or wherever they were staying because Betty was expected to do it. Betty was now expected to fulfill her role right away, even on the honeymoon vacation, of cooking and cleaning for both of them. Betty was not accustomed to this lifestyle of sort of cooking and cleaning because in her childhood home, her mother didn't really do that sort of stuff. They had a maid. She was always very well taken care of and had never struggled financially, so this new status was foreign to her. And I don't really think it was the relationship or the marriage that Betty was anticipating. Immediately after the wedding, because of the wedding, Betty and her mother's relationship became pretty strained. Betty's mother was embarrassed because instead of renting a luxury suit, Dan had just worn any old suit that he had in his closet, and they got married in that. And as I said, Betty's mother was embarrassed and said he was making them all look like fools and poor, basically. It appeared that Betty's mother was ashamed of her son-in-law, so she wouldn't let Betty store any of her stuff at her childhood home, so Betty was forced to take all her belongings and put it into Daniel's cramped medical dormitory. At this point, she said that she wanted to leave Dan because it wasn't the life she expected or the marriage she expected, but she stayed because she found out she was pregnant with Kim. She had taken a job at a local school as a third grade teacher just shortly before she married Dan, and they were struggling financially so badly that Betty actually hid her pregnancy from the school until basically the day that she gave birth so she could keep receiving paychecks. After Dan received his medical degree from Cornell, he decided that he wanted to switch paths and get his JD, which is a Juris Doctor degree, just to be a lawyer. It's the most prestigious type of law degree you can get, I believe, in America. I think he made this career switch because he saw more prestige and wealth in that sort of field. He got accepted and started attending Harvard Law School, and while he was studying, Betty worked a lot and basically raised their daughter on her own. His ultimate goal was to combine his expertise in medicine with his degree in law to sort of do malpractice lawsuits. At this time, they moved to a suburb in Somerville, Massachusetts. While he was studying, Betty was expected to do everything and also sort of make up and pay for the bills. She was expected to work, cook, clean, take care of their child, take care of their daughter Kim, who was born in 1970. She also worked part-time, taking night shifts at a department store, and during the day she would babysit so the couple could pay the bills. So it seemed that all the responsibility was on Betty at this time in their life, and she did everything she could to support Dan in achieving his dreams and eventually hoping that they would be wealthy, I guess. Shortly after giving birth to their first child in 1970, the couple conceived again, and they gave birth to their second daughter, Lee, in 1971. A couple years later, Dan graduated from Harvard in 1973. Shortly afterwards, he took a job as a law associate at a prestigious law firm called Gary, Carey, Ames, and Fry. So this law firm was fairly prestigious and well known. It was pretty large and was located in San Diego. After he started this job, the whole family had to uproot and move to San Diego, presumably, and Betty said she felt even more isolated because she was so far from her family and friends and everything she had ever known. During the first 3 to 5 years of Dan's career in law, he still just made a pretty modest income. Each year he made around $30,000, so the family continued to live pretty frugally for some time. She continued to sort of have to subsidize the income and work night shifts at a restaurant. After a few years at the firm, he originally worked insurance and personal injury cases. He was promoted and started working in malpractice suits. His charisma and his knack for public speaking was immediately recognized, and he did really well in this position. At this point, point, Dan started earning more money. It was around the mid 1970s, so he took care of the bills. She stopped looking at bills at all, and she became the perfect little housewife who didn't have to worry about money, which is what I think she wanted from the start. At this point, she didn't even have her own personal bank account, and she never paid a bill, so I don't even think she saw money at all unless she was spending it on their credit card. So as I said, by the mid 1970s, all their financial struggles and burdens were alleviated, and they became a pretty middle upper class family fairly quickly. Then they gave birth to their third child, their first son, named Daniel, named after good old Dan himself. Betty said that Dan began spending less and less time at home. He would go to work extremely early, and then after work he would go out drinking until late in the night, so he wasn't helping with childcare or anything or being present in their kids' lives at all at this period. And later on in interviews and other things, Dan has admitted that he was a pretty bad husband and father during this time period because he was essentially absent and didn't really care about his wife and family's feelings. Betty said that even when Dan initially started earning more money at the firm, she still continued to live frugally, mostly because of Dan's own doing. He would stock his closet with brand name suits, and he sort of had to live this luxurious life, and he excused this as like he had to uphold his reputation. He had to look like a famous rich lawyer. He had to play the part to get the part, sort of thing. Meanwhile, Betty and her kids were sort of living on discounted clothing and just living more of a lower middle class lifestyle. She also continued to work, I think, in the mid 1970s, occasionally selling products for Avon and selling Tupperware. She said she was pretty incredibly unhappy with her life, but through it all, she continued to support Dan. So now we move on to the sort of a breakdown and lead up to Betty and Dan's divorce. So in 1978, Dan decided after around 5 years that he was going to leave the firm he had been working at to open his own law firm and business. His business was an instant success, and Betty was super supportive, and the family became more well off. In 1979, Betty gave birth to their fourth child, a second son named Rhett. I think in the early 70s, Betty and Dan were pregnant again, and she did give birth, but the child passed after 4 days, and Betty said she didn't even have a chance to name this child. Betty also said that Dan forced her to stay off birth control because of his Catholic upbringing. They sort of demonized birth control at the time. So even though she wanted to take birth control and sort of not have any more kids, Dan kept forcing her, essentially. As I said, Betty was extremely supportive of Dan opening his own firm, and she actually helped him decorate his new office to feel more prestigious and more at home for him. At this time, after he opened his own firm, the couple and the family began living a pretty lavish lifestyle. In fact, they sent their kids to very prestigious, expensive private schools. They joined 2 country clubs in their area. They bought a boat and several luxury cars. Although Betty does her best in the public to continuously portray that she was this good, tireless, working mother, her kids do occasionally paint a different view of their childhood and of Betty. The eldest, Kim, seemed to have the most strained and stressed relationship with her mother, and she's been the most outspoken against her mother, although she does say she thinks her mother is a good person and does love her mother. Like later on in her adult life, she says this. Kim said that growing up, Betty had a really bad temper, and she would constantly be yelling at Dan for various things. And in one article, Kim recalls one time when Lee was in trouble, so Betty took Lee outside and hit her repeatedly with a sort of fly swatter thing until welts appeared on Lee's body. Kim said she took her younger brother Daniel Jr. and they hid in the closet until the beating was over. Kim said she constantly begged her father Dan to leave Betty and take primary custody of her. It's sort of murky what the exact, like, the inner workings of the family was, as each kid seems to have a different narrative and a different story. A lot of them don't actually like Dan and don't think Dan was a good present father, and I don't believe Dan was very present. I don't think his family and being present and spending time with his family was a priority. However, I do think it's pretty evident that Betty did have a temper, even though she tries to say that, oh, in her early life she never had a temper and it was all Dan's fault and that's why she got violent. But I think it's probably a prolonged chronic behavior of hers, so I don't think there's any true victims or villains in this story. It's sort of all very gray. Dan's brother Larry, who has always been against Betty, obviously she murdered his brother, said that the reason Dan was away from the house was because of his terrible marriage to Betty, which I don't know how true this is because Larry wasn't present in the house, so he doesn't really know. I do want to mention that I only found this mention of physical abuse alleged by Kim corroborated in one media story online. I can't find any other allegation of physical abuse against her kids, so it is a little confusing and murky to me about how accurate this is because I can't find more than one source to back it up, so I just want to mention that. But I still wanted to mention that there is allegations against Betty for being physically and emotionally abusive to her children, because as I said, this case is very gray. All the adults in this story live in this sort of gray area. There's good and bad seem to be sort of murkier. So I don't want to bias my narrative to be more favorable to Betty or Dan, because I believe both of them did a lot of things wrong and hurt each other and their kids a lot. Shortly after Dan started working at his new firm, Betty said she noticed him being less physically and romantically interested in her, and this set off alarm bells in her head. Dan was often very strict and controlling with Betty about how she spent her money. Like when she would buy things on his credit card, he would sort of get angry and instigate fights with her, even though he was known to spend a lot of money on himself, such as the brand name luxury suits and cars. He sort of excused his spending as maintaining his rich and high baller lawyer life / reputation. But as he got more wealthy, Dan did eventually hire a maid for the house so Betty could finally put her feet up and be the socialite and mother she had always dreamed of. There are two accounts that sort of paint Dan as a little bit more of a bad husband and father. One of the accounts was from one of the maids that worked in the house, and she said that she didn't like Dan at all. She found him very cold and unfriendly, and she noticed that whenever Dan was around, Betty seemed a lot more frigid and afraid. And then the second account is from one of the family's neighbors who said that when Dan wasn't around during the day, she was extremely bubbly and happy, but an hour or so before Dan was expected home, she would become frantic and anxious. She would erratically clean the house. She would pick up all the kids' toys and belongings from the floor and tuck them away because she said Dan became extremely angry and hated it when the kids' stuff was strewn about. And this neighbor also reiterated that Betty seemed often afraid when Dan was around, or just more on guard. In September of 1983, Dan hired a new legal assistant, Linda Culkin, who had previously worked briefly as a flight attendant and then later on as a sort of receptionist for an attorney that worked in the same building as Dan. Earlier that year in 1983, Betty, while attending a party thrown by one of Dan's attorney friends, overheard Dan comments about how beautiful he thought Linda was, and Betty thought this was extremely strange because she didn't know him to be a man like that, a man that would notice other women's beauty. When Dan hired Linda for the job as his legal assistant, Betty was extremely shocked and taken aback by this because Linda had no relevant experience. She had no paralegal experience and she had no malpractice law experience, so she was kind of like a random choice for the job because she had no relevant skills. In fact, she didn't even know how to type, which was a huge part of the job. Linda Culkenna is often dismissed and overlooked in the media's portrayal of her, and I'm not going to sit here and act like the only thing to Linda Linda Cullen was that she was the other woman. In fact, in a book that goes into detail about the case, it describes Linda as a teenage office bimbo. I tried to do research on Linda so I could present her to you as a fully fleshed out and thoughtful individual, but there's not much really known about her early life. But what is known is that Linda Cullen was born in 1961 to parents who were extremely strict Catholics, similar to both Betty and Dan's parents. Her parents had immigrated from the Netherlands to America in the 1950s. Linda had at least one sibling that I know of or that I could find, which was a sister named Maggie. Maggie recounted her childhood to be hers and Linda's childhood to be very similar to Betty, as in they were raised to eventually become housewives. Maggie said, quote, "Our expectation was to grow up and have children. You work to work, but not to have a career. We weren't cultured that way. The man should always be the breadwinner." Linda graduated from a high school in Salt Lake City, Utah, and shortly after graduating, she took a job as a flight attendant for Delta Airlines. She was fired shortly afterwards, like probably a month or two afterwards, for obscene language to another stewardess and for conduct unbecoming of a Delta employee. It was basically alleged that Linda had, while off duty on a flight, sat on a male passenger's lap and was sort of flirting with him. I don't really know what the obscene language to another flight attendant or flight stewardess is about, but that's why she was fired. Linda is often branded as a one-dimensional slut in the media, and as I said before, I don't want to perpetuate that narrative about Linda. She was a fully formed human. She had more to her than just being Dan's second wife, and I'm not going to sit and label her a slut. As I said, I don't think she's like extremely virtuous and good person, because she did know about Betty and she knowingly entered into a relationship with an older man who was married and had a family. But we also don't know the interworkings of that relationship, and Linda never came forward to explain if she felt that she was manipulated or coerced or anything or treated badly by Dan, and we'll never know because her life was taken from her. After she was fired from Delta Airlines, she took a job as a freelance assistant, and after she was fired from her job at Delta Airlines, she took a job as a freelance receptionist, and one of her reception assignments was as the receptionist of the attorney that worked in Dan's building. So Dan and Linda met shortly after she began working there. Betty was immediately suspicious of the relationship between Linda and Dan, especially after the comments she overheard at that party, and also because Dan, in all his years at the firm, he had opened it 4 or 5 years previously, he had never wanted a legal assistant because he liked to be in control of everything and sort of organize everything himself. Even when Betty begged him to get a legal assistant so he could spend more time at home, he refused. So it was confusing to her why he would hire an inexperienced young woman to be his legal assistant when he had never wanted one before. Betty started to notice throughout, I believe, the year of 1973 or a bit later on, Betty started to notice more suspicious behavior from Dan. One time she saw him send flowers to Linda while they were on vacation in London, and at another time while they were vacationing in New York, she saw him sneak a phone call while they were staying at a hotel. On that New York trip, Betty became increasingly worried about the state of her marriage and became more worried that it was going to fall apart. On that trip, Dan and Betty took a walk around the city, sort of just passing through the city and going to old places they used to go at the beginning of their relationship. On this walk, Betty claims that Dan told her that he didn't love her anymore. In fact, he hated her. Believing this sort of change in his feelings was caused by his relationship with Linda, he demanded that she fire him, or he fire her. Dan denied that the affair was happening and refused to fire Linda. This sort of denial of the affair that was pretty obviously happening at this time, and sort of respective gaslighting that he was doing, calling or insinuating that Betty was crazy for even alleging that Dan was having an affair affair resulted in her becoming increasingly paranoid and more mentally unwell. Even during this time, Betty went to a therapist to sort of rein in her paranoia, and she tried to lull herself into this false sense of security, sort of trying to believe Dan's lies and try to believe, even though she knew it was happening, that he wasn't having this affair. In early November, Betty claims she tried to commit suicide, or she tried to complete suicide by taking a handful of pills and slitting her wrists. This attempt came after Dan had missed her 36th birthday party for an unknown reason. He didn't even really give her an excuse. He just didn't show up. Later that November, for Dan's 39th birthday, Betty, at around lunchtime, went to Dan's office to surprise him with some birthday presents. When she was there, she noticed that both Dan and Linda were absent from the office, so she broke into his office. Well, she didn't really break in, but she entered his office and saw the remnants of a sort of birthday celebration. There was cake and like decorations and stuff and champagne. The receptionist actually told Betty that Linda and Dan had been absent most of the day. So Betty was spiraling at this point, hell-bent that her husband was 100% having an affair with this younger, beautiful woman. So she goes home, she takes all of Dan's designer suits out of his closet. This is in front of her kids, sadly. And she throws them all in the yard in a pile, pours gasoline on them, and sets them on fire. When Dan arrives home, she confronts him and she tries to kick him out of the house. She tells him to leave. He refuses to leave and sort of continuously denies the affair, says it's not happening, that she's crazy, and she sort of believes it for the time being. Dan's brother Larry then tries to paint Dan as more of a victim than he probably was by stating that Dan was a good Catholic man and that his Catholic upbringing prevented him from leaving Betty, and that's why he stayed. I have a hard time believing this. I think Dan just sort of liked having two women, and he wanted to maintain his good reputation and not have it exposed that he was having an extramarital affair. In 1984, Dan moves Betty and their children out of their home, which I think is on Coral Reef Lane or a street or avenue or whatever, and he moves them all into a rental house. A few months later, in early 1985, Dan moves himself, without his children or his wife, back into their old house and states that he needs space from Betty. At this time, he still won't admit to the affair, and he says he just needs space to think about things, but it's not because there's another woman, but obviously it was. Desperate to prove to Dan that he still needed her, on Easter, so April of 1985, from that time to the next month and a half, one by one, she would drop the kids off on Dan's doorstep, so he would have to take care of them. She first dropped off Kim, their eldest, on Easter. Her point was trying to prove that Dan needed her to take care of the family. I guess Dan didn't sort of react the way she hoped and didn't really ask for her back and like beg for her back as she wanted, and Betty's behavior escalated because of this. In June 1985, Betty broke into their old house and trashed it. She trashed his bedroom completely, and then she began spray painting the walls and various things, including the fireplace, black. On two other occasions, the first, Betty broke back into the house, saw a Boston cream pie that Linda presumably made for Dan because it was his favorite, so she smeared it all over his bed. And then the other occasion, she came and threw 2 wine bottles through the house's windows. Throughout all these outbursts, which is the most awful and tragic part to me, is that her kids were nearby, her young kids were nearby watching their mother be extremely violent and erratic. Dan finally files for divorce from Betty in September of 1985, and he is granted a temporary restraining order. This restraining order actually prohibits Betty from coming within 100 meters of Dan's house, office, and car. She basically immediately broke these guidelines guidelines by going to his house, swinging an umbrella through a picture window, and then breaking in and breaking a new toaster. Dan filed criminal charges against Betty for this outburst. So obviously there's been a bit of a scene change. It's just like a different week. I started school and this case was more research than I had initially anticipated, so this could be a rather long video. So different day, different set, different everything. Betty later on in interviews and stuff tried to explain her volatile or excuse her volatile behavior by blaming it mostly, if not solely, on Dan. She said Dan was trying to make it look like she was initiating or causing the divorce so he would maintain his good reputation. So the divorce wouldn't be blamed on him and having the affair, it would be blamed on Betty's erratic behavior or her initiating the divorce. She said he was manipulating everything and everybody so that she would end up looking crazy in the end and losing everything. Sometime midway through 1985, when the divorce and custody battles were ongoing, Betty said she tried to find her own legal counsel, but said it was extremely difficult for her due to Dan's status in like their town and his reputation and connections. Around this time, she tried to hire lawyer Thomas Ashworth, who was a very prestigious divorce attorney in their town, but he refused to take her case because he said he was going to be appointed a judge soon. Shortly afterwards, Ashworth became Dan's actual attorney in the divorce proceedings, but he only was his attorney for a few months because he was appointed to be a judge later on. Later on, Ashworth claimed that he doesn't remember Betty ever asking him to be her counsel, but he says that if she did ask him, he probably wouldn't have taken the case because he was somewhat friends with Dan. She eventually found an attorney who was located in Beverly Hills named Daniel Jaffe. I don't know. He had a pretty good reputation. He was known for being a pretty decent attorney, but he was very quickly overwhelmed by representing Betty because of her erratic and violent behavior. He had tried repeatedly to get Betty to abide by the guidelines that were imposed by Dan's restraining order against her so he could focus on the divorce case and getting her fair share or whatnot, but he said Betty would never comply, and it just seemed like Betty just didn't want the divorce, so she was doing anything in her power to delay proceedings and stuff like that. So Daniel was extremely frustrated with her. So instead of having the time and the space to be able to like focus on how he would defend or fight for Betty's property and stuff like that in the divorce and the custody, he always had to just go to court and answer for her indiscretions or her breaking the restraining order. So all his time for her case was used up doing that. So much of the specifics of their divorce is actually unknown because Dan got it sealed from the public, but at the very least, it was a very messy and prolonged divorce. It's interesting that Dan would fight to get it sealed while Betty was really advocating to have the divorce made public. Dan said it was just to sort of, there was so much publicity around it already that he wanted the privacy, but Betty said it was him like hiding his indiscretions and his abuse and his bad behavior. Eventually, Daniel resigned from representing Betty in the divorce proceedings after working with her for about 6 months. Betty said it was because Dan refused to pay the retainer fee for the lawyer, which he had promised to pay, which was around $10,000, and Betty allegedly didn't have the money at the time to pay the retainer. But both Dan and Daniel say this is not the case, that it's actually just because Betty was so difficult to work with. In my opinion, Betty was 100% so difficult and annoying to work with. She was really dragging her feet in the divorce because she never wanted the divorce. Her dreams and her goals in life were to have that nuclear family, and sort of she had it and it was now being taken away from her. So she was doing anything in her power to delay proceedings in hopes that maybe Dan would change his mind eventually and come back to her. So that's awful, but I also believe Dan plays an equal role in that that part because he had no sympathy or care for Betty a lot of the time. He sort of didn't try to make anything easy on her, considering he had an affair for years or so, for a prolonged period of time, and then lied to her and gaslighted her when she questioned him about the affair, only to then just randomly move out and leave her for the other woman. Throughout the divorce proceedings, Betty was constantly cycling through different attorneys, hiring and firing them constantly, which in my opinion is just her trying to prolong the process. So in early 1986, when Daniel, her first attorney, was still representing Betty, their respective lawyers, Dan and Betty's respective lawyers, had met at like a settlement meeting, and they discussed different, like they wanted to sell the first house Betty and Dan had purchased together and lived in together. So the settlement was about how to sell the house and how to distribute the earnings or the whatever they got from the sale. So at the settlement, the two lawyers and their respective clients came to an agreement about what their shares of the sale would be, but at the last minute, Betty pulled out and refused to sign her signature, to her lawyer Daniel's dismay. When she refused to sign the papers, Dan got his attorney to file an emergency court order to enable him to sell the house without Betty's signature, and that's what happened. This is the point where Betty seemed to snap even more when her lawyer called her and said that the house had been sold. She received the share that they initially had agreed upon, but obviously this isn't what Betty wanted for her. That house represented what was remaining of her past life, and she really didn't want this divorce, so she completely lost it when Daniel told her that the house was sold. At this time, Dan had moved into a new, larger house. I believe he was living in with Linda at the time, so this made Betty even more insane. So she drove over to Dan's new house with her car and drove straight into his front door. Dan came out to confront her. Some reports say that Betty actually brought a knife to this altercation and was threatening Dan with it, but I don't know how accurate this detail is, because most publications that talk about the Betty Broderick case don't mention the knife. It's just mentioned in a minority, so take that with a grain of salt. Anyways, Dan calls the police, as he probably should, and then he convinces the police to put her into a 5150, which is a 72-hour mental health hold. So in front of her 4 kids and Dan, the, I guess, ambulance or ER or whatever, people come, whoever takes people away to 5150s, they put her in a straitjacket and she's taken away into an ambulance and is held for the 72 hours. So that was extremely traumatic for her, and she says that was Dan trying to establish that she was crazy and mentally unhinged, which, like, Betty, you drove into his front door, like, what did you expect to happen? I don't know. It's just like, Betty's a little bit deluded and doesn't seem to like fully grasp the consequences of her actions. Anyways, during the 72-hour hold, I don't know the official like diagnoses or like conclusions of the doctors that were watching over her and interviewing her and stuff like that, but I do know that throughout this hold, all she was saying was that she wasn't the crazy one, that it was Dan, and it was Dan trying to make her look crazy, and that she hadn't done anything wrong and stuff like that. At this time, Betty was receiving around $9,000 in like these alimony / support payments. I guess they were unofficial this time because they hadn't divorced, so I don't know if you can get alimony before divorce. I don't know. I'm not super versed on United States divorce laws. But Dan sort of used this to further control Betty and her erratic behavior. So every time Betty did something that Dan didn't really like, which was she was constantly acting out, he would take a sizable amount of money away. So from the $9,000 payment, it's reported that he would deduct $100 for obscene language, $250 for stepping foot on his property, $500 for entering his property, and $1,000 for every time she took the kids without his permission. Like, I kind of understand Dan's rationale by deducting these payments in an attempt to control Betty, but I do think it's just like adds more to us understanding his character, that he was an extremely controlling person and that he wanted things to go his way or he couldn't handle it. Like, he wasn't reaching out to Betty and trying to speak to her in a compassionate way. He was doing it in a sort of aggressive and manipulative way almost. Betty says that there was 1 month that Dan charged or took off so much money that he actually sent her a notice saying that she owed him $1,300. I don't know how legal this process is either. I don't know if you can do stuff like that either. So their whole arrangement and relationship at this point is so weird to me, and that is just... Anyways, the alimony was later increased to $16,000 a month. Dan and his counsel filed for divorce or completed the divorce officially in July 1986 when Betty wasn't present at the proceedings. Daniel, Jeffy, whatever, who was her first attorney, she was sort of in between attorneys at the time, and she was representing herself, so no one had told her to go to the meeting. She said she believed that if she just didn't show up, the court would postpone it until she got like counsel or she was present, but they just did it without her present. I guess Dan used his sort of lawyer knowledge to swindle that. So that's sort of another way that Dan is controlling of the situation, and Betty is left to be the stupid almost one that doesn't understand, and Dan just goes over her head to do things. So through him and his lawyer talking to the judge, Dan is basically awarded everything. Like, he doesn't really have to pay Betty anything, he doesn't owe Betty anything, and he has full custody of the kids with no visitation rights from Betty. Even though she was an erratic and neurotic person, her kids were extremely important to her, and she had dedicated basically her whole life to them when Dan was an absent father. So this is completely backhanded and cruel of him to do, in my opinion, because he was the only one present. He was the only one that was setting the terms. So obviously he had not given her anything. He wouldn't even give her visitation, which is extremely cruel to me, especially when his kids sort of barely knew him because he was always away at work or like fraternizing with the bros. Betty claims that Dan was sort of swindling the judge or manipulating the judge into framing Betty as this like incompetent parent and partner, and I do believe Betty in this situation because Dan completely went underhand and didn't give Betty anything. And I think it's sort of reprehensible to be a lawyer. I think it's ethically reprehensible to be a lawyer yourself and know that everyone, no matter what they've done, deserves the right to legal counsel and have appropriate legal counsel and to be aware of what's happening to them legally. And he still sort of was unethical about the situation and did this all behind her back when Betty had no legal counsel or no one to tell her what was right or what was wrong. When Betty's former lawyer found out what Dan and his lawyer had done behind Betty's back in court, he found it extremely reprehensible. So even though he wasn't representing or being paid by Betty, he went out of his way to call Dan's attorney and sort of settle different arrangements and negotiate different arrangements. And when they were called out, Dan and his lawyer sort of backed down a bit, and I believe they allowed her to see the kids. And Dan also agreed that he would pay a retainer fee, a lawyer retainer fee, for Betty to find a new decent lawyer. So her new lawyer was named William Hargraves. He later said that Betty was an impossible client because she couldn't imagine living without Dan. So she went out of her way to, as I've said, to make things as hard as possible for things to proceed legally. But he also said that Dan's behavior and his need for control around everything in his life was what he deemed obsessive. Throughout their lengthy divorce, which went for about 3 to 4 years before they finally settled on terms, Betty would call Linda Kolkena and Dan and leave very crude and horrific messages on their answering machine, usually multiple times a day, and a lot of which her children overheard, and it really disturbed them, obviously. She often, on these phone messages, referred to Linda not by her name, but just as the whore. So throughout this period of their life, Dan and Betty's 4 children started to suffer greatly because of the extremely volatile relationship between their 2 parents. Their second eldest daughter, Lee, began struggling with drugs at this time, and she dropped out of school. In Instead of seeing this as like almost his doing and seeing Lee's behavior as a cry for help, Dan decided to disown her. He had literally nothing to do with Lee after this, and he wrote her out of his will. He also briefly kicked out his eldest daughter, Kim, when she turned 18 for seemingly no reason, just because he thought she should be self-sufficient. But shortly afterwards, he let her come home because obviously an 18-year-old can't really be self-sufficient without any resources. So Dan is not a great father. I think Betty is more dedicated and more loving to her kids, but her hate for Dan and Linda caused her to become a pretty bad and toxic mother. And the two younger boys always preferred their mother's presence. They always wanted to be with their mom. They didn't really like visiting with their dad. They would constantly like be on the phone with their mom when they were over at their dad's and stuff like that. I do put equal blame on both Betty and Dan for prioritizing their bitter relationship with each other and their hate for each other over the well-being of their kids. I really think that if Betty had focused on just her children, that this would be completely different. Although Dan was extremely manipulative and used their kids sort of as bargaining chips to get Betty to behave in a way he wanted to as well. So Betty claimed that Linda eventually joined in on the taunting too. She said that Linda would send her like ads in the mail for like weight loss or wrinkle creams and stuff like this. Linda's friends say Linda would never do something like this, and they say she was a kind person that wasn't vindictive, so who knows. Betty and Dan were officially divorced in January of 1989. So at the final divorce trial, which sort of tied up all the loose ends and concluded all the custody issues and the financial settlements and stuff like that, and the doling out of the property and who was going to get what sort of things, Betty asked to be paid $25,000 each month in alimony for 10 years and then $1 million up front. Betty had no attorney at the time, by the way. I guess she was between lawyers again, and so she was representing herself in this trial once again, which, oh my god, Betty. Dan and his legal aid concurred that he would pay her $9,000 in alimony for the first year and then $5,000 each month for a few years after that until she got remarried. To counter the upfront settlement, the $1 million that Betty had asked for, Dan presented Epstein credits. So I'm going to read this off because I'm a Neanderthal and don't 100% understand what Epstein credits are. So my understanding is that debts that were incurred by the couple throughout their marriage are considered community debts. So both of their debts, even if it's like one person's student loans, it's considered both of their loans or debts that are then paid off by one party after the couple officially separates or files for divorce. It needs to be reimbursed by the member of the couple that didn't pay off the debts. So in this case, through the 4-year separation/divorce proceedings of Betty and Dan had paid off a lot of debts that the couple had incurred in their 16-year marriage. Some of the debts included Dan's student loans from Harvard. So even though it was just his loans, it was him basically was the only one benefiting from it. It was considered her debt too, so he paid off a bunch of stuff. So he presented all the things that he had paid off, all the debts he had paid off in the 4-year separation period, and said that Betty needed to reimburse him for paying off these debts, or needed to reimburse 50% of what he had paid off. So eventually, after being presented with these Epstein credits by Dan and his lawyer, he sided, or the judge, I don't know if it's a he or she, I'm being sexist, but I'm assuming it's a he. The judge eventually sided mostly with Dan and concluded that Betty needed to reimburse Dan around $750,000 in Epstein credits. And as I said, this did include his student loan debt from Harvard Law School. So subtracting the Epstein credits and everything else, the judge ruled that in an upfront settlement, he only had to pay Betty $28,000 instead of the $1 million, and ruled that he would continue to pay Betty $16,000 in alimony each month. Betty claimed that Dan had sort of mass paid off all his debts because he knew about Epstein credits and was just trying to give Betty less and less money, and I do think this is true. Dan denies it and said he didn't know what Epstein credits were until like a few months before the official, like the last trial that they had or the last ruling. I don't believe this. You've been a lawyer for like 10, 15 years. Like, you should know what Epstein credits are, even if you're not a divorce attorney. Like, you went to Harvard Law School. In the final proceedings, she got full custody of one of their children, which was Lee, because, as I said, Dan wanted nothing to do with her because he was a shitty father. So I think he got the other 3 children, he got primary custody, and then she got visitation. I'm not 100% sure. Like, she got them on the weekends or something like that. So after the divorce was finalized, Dan and Linda got married in their front yard on April 22nd, 1989, which was only 10 days after what would have been Betty and Dan's 20th wedding anniversary. Dan hired security in anticipation for Betty to come and try to ruin the wedding, and Linda, out of neurosis, tried to convince Dan to wear a bulletproof vest to the ceremony, but Dan refused, saying that he was the golden goose. He had all the money that Betty was getting, so she would never actually kill him. I don't think Betty did anything on this day. There seems to be no incident that was reported. After the wedding, Linda and Dan had their honeymoon in the Caribbean, which was weirdly the same place, same area that Dan and Betty had honeymooned in. Around 6-7 months later, on November 5th, 1989, the couple has been married for 6-7 months, as I've said, and Betty decides to drive to their house extremely early in the morning when everyone's sleeping. Using a key that she had stolen from her daughter Lee, she goes in through the back door of their house while Linda and Dan are still sleeping. She brought a gun with her, a Smith & Wesson revolver that she had purchased 8 months prior. She enters the newlyweds' bedroom as they are still sleeping, and at some point she removes the landline that's located in their house, or in the bedroom, sorry. This is a point of contention as to if the murder was premeditated or not, based on when she removed the landline or why she removed the landline. I'll go back to it later on in the court proceedings. Betty then fires the gun at the sleeping couple, or I guess they've awoken by now, I'm not really sure, around 5 times. Linda dies immediately after she is shot both in the head and the chest. Dan, who is only shot once in the chest, dies slowly, and Betty says that they're able to have a conversation before, or they're able to talk a bit before he dies. I don't really know what the conversation entailed, but Betty said that Dan's final words were, quote, "Okay, you shot me, I'm dead." After murdering Linda and Dan, she starts just frantically calling family and friends. At some point, maybe the first phone call, maybe not, it's unclear, she calls her 2 daughters. Kim, the eldest, picks up the phone, and Betty tells her daughter that she shot both Linda and Dan. She also tells her daughter Kim that she had planned to commit suicide, but the gun had run out of bullets. There are some discrepancies about Kim's recounting of the phone call with her mom, because Betty had 2 trials, which I'll explain why in a bit. So her story sort of slightly differed from the first trial to the second trial. In the first trial, Kim said that her mom was hysterically crying on the phone and told her what Dan's last words were. In the second trial, Kim says she doesn't remember her mom crying at all, and that she doesn't remember her mom ever saying what Dan's last words were. A lot of people on Betty's side believe that Kim's change in testimony is because she was coached by Dan's family to sort of make Betty look more unsympathetic and more like a cold-blooded killer, more like it was premeditated and less like it was sort of a crime of passion. Kim never wavered on her position that her mom was never remorseful or never expressed remorse to her about the murders. So after speaking with Kim and maybe Lee, Betty starts to frantically call a few more people to confess what she's done, including one of her friends named Diane Black. Diane then calls Betty's sort of boyfriend named Bradley T. Wright and informs him what Betty has done. It's reported that Bradley was actually was at Betty's house when this happened, like he was still asleep when Betty left to shoot the couple. So he's extremely in a panic. So he calls one of Dan's friends that I believe is a neighbor, lives nearby, and tells him to meet them at the Broderick house to see what's happened. So Brad walks into the house and finds the dead bodies of both Linda and Dan, but Betty has fled the scene at this point. So it's actually Bradley who calls 911 and reports the murders. As I've said, Betty already fled the scene by the time Bradley had come to the Broderick house and discovered the bodies, but she did turn herself in shortly afterwards to the San Diego Police Department, and she never once denied that she was the one who committed the murders. She confessed immediately. So I'm going to take a brief aside to talk about the weird relationship between Betty Broderick and Bradley T. Wright. Bradley T. Wright was 36 at the time of the murders, and which was around 6 years younger than Betty at the time. Bradley stated afterwards that he was in a relationship with Betty for 4 years prior to the murders. Betty denies this, saying that she is a child of God and would never be intimate with someone outside of marriage, and she had only ever been with her husband sexually. She later on goes back on this and said that she did sleep with both of the men, but the sex was better with her husband Dan because it was her husband and not just some random man out of wedlock. Poor Brad. I tend to lean towards Bradley's recounting of their relationship because he has no motivation to lie, whereas Betty is trying to make herself look like this sad, lonely old woman who has no one to love her in court. So her having a boyfriend, a live-in boyfriend at that, counters what she's trying to portray. Betty, before admitting that they did actually have sex a bit, said that they did have a weird sort of domestic relationship where they would sleep in the same bed, not doing any hanky-panky, and then she would leave little like to-do lists on the refrigerator of errands she needed done around the house and stuff, and he would get them done. So they were sort of like a married couple. She said she played the woman part and he played the man part in a marriage. Her daughters Lee and Kim testified that they had walked in on Brad and their mother in the shower, and this was a huge fight between the daughters and their mother because they didn't understand why she was so vindictive against Linda and Dan about their relationship when she had a whole nother relationship with Bradley. Bradley stayed by her side while she was in jail and stuff like that. I don't know if he's still with her, but he stayed with her for a significant amount of time after she was in jail and stuff and arrested. So Betty had 2 trials for the murder of Linda Colkenna and Dan Broderick. Betty's first trial began on October 22nd, 1990. She was represented at the time by an attorney named Jack Early. Jack's main legal strategy was to paint Betty as a battered woman who snapped after years and years of various types of abuse. They claimed that Dan was extremely abusive towards Betty during their 16-year marriage and the time after that he had abused her sexually, physically, and psychologically. To back up their allegations of abuse, the defense brought in Daniel Sunken. I don't know why there's so many Daniels in this case. but anyways, who was a licensed marriage and family therapist, but I don't think he had a PhD. I think it was just like a master's, so he's not a doctor. He testified that he believed that Betty had suffered from extreme abuse at the hands of Dan. Betty's defense, using Sunkin's, the family therapist, testimony, asserted that Dan Broderick was an alcoholic and he would often come home inebriated and sexually assault Betty. This family therapist said he came to this conclusion after conducting 3 interviews with Betty and interviews with family and friends and the couple's daughter Lee. On cross-examination, the prosecution was quick to point out that the family therapist had not interviewed the other 3 kids, Kim and the 2 sons, and as well as any of Dan's friends or family. They specifically focused on the therapist not interviewing Kim, who in the case was testifying against her mother, but a few of her friends did go on stand to testify that on various occasions they had seen bruises on Betty's body as well as her having black eyes. Sunkin, the family therapist, concluded that Betty was driven mad by the abuse she experienced by Dan and was driven to murder out of this delirium and not because she was a cold-blooded, vengeful killer. I don't really know how to feel about this defense because there is no concrete evidence for Dan being that level of abusive. He did obviously psychologically abuse her by gaslighting her for years and stuff like that, and being an absent parent and just leaving her, all that stuff. He was obviously, and by his own admission, he admitted he was a bad husband. So that is true, but there is no concrete evidence that he was sexually or physically abusive to Betty. But I also know that in a lot of cases of domestic abuse, there isn't a lot of concrete evidence because victims don't report it. So who knows? It's just like, it's hard to believe anything that Betty says because she is kind of a liar and always flip-flops around the truth. Also, she displayed, in my opinion, abusive behavior towards Linda and Dan and her children as well. So you can't completely write it off because she is a woman. So there's also that to consider. So I don't think Dan or Betty was 100% the innocent victim in this case. I believe they both contributed to an abusive and toxic environment for their family. So that's my conclusion or my opinion. As previously mentioned, Kim testified on behalf of the prosecution at the first trial. She stated that she didn't believe her mom was remorseful for the murders of Linda and Dan and that she had never verbally expressed remorse to Kim. And she also defended her father and said that he wasn't this extremely abusive man, that he was pretty much an absent father, but he wasn't this monster that Betty was trying to paint him out to be. One of the prosecution's major defenses was a 30-minute phone call between Betty and her young son, Daniel Jr., who was around 11 years old at the time of the call. Throughout the phone call, Daniel Jr. it's horrific. He's just crying and begging his mom to stop antagonizing Linda and Dan, that all he wants to do is be with his mom and live with his mom, and she's making it impossible because of her behavior. And she seems pretty cold in this phone call where she's just calling Linda a whore and saying that it's all Linda and Dan's fault and that Daniel Jr. should blame them for it and not the mother, blah blah blah. Eventually, Betty took the stand and testified on her own behalf. She stated that she felt unworthy and unlovable because of the verbal abuse she had suffered by Dan, in which he constantly called her fat, ugly, and dumb. Not funny. She said that towards the end of her marriage, she felt his love and affection or attraction towards her waning. So she did everything she could to sort of be beautiful for him, including these like cosmetic procedures and stuff like that to try to reignite that spark that she so desperately wanted. But he was dismissive of her and continued to say these insults, which I tend to believe that Dan would say something like that. She said that she was so miserable because of her marriage to Dan that that she attempted to complete suicide on her 36th birthday, as I previously mentioned, by slitting her wrists and taking a handful of pills. She said that Dan was the one who found her the next morning, found her with the cuts and the pills and stuff like that, and that instead of trying to comfort her and lend a sympathetic ear and just hear her out, he started berating her. He said that she couldn't do this to the kids, and that just because she attempted suicide or tried to complete suicide, it wasn't going to change anything, like to stop doing it for pity and stuff like that. On cross-examination, the prosecution sort of tried to dispute the suicide attempt because there was no hospital records and stuff like that. So Betty, in the showboaty nature that she is, went to each jury member and showed them her wrists and the scars on her wrist that remained from the suicide attempt. She testified that on the morning of the murders, it wasn't a premeditated murder, that she had went to Dan and Linda's house with the gun to send him a message. She wanted to shoot herself in front of Dan to have basically the blood on his hands, and he would have to clean up the mess and stuff like that. So that's what she wanted, to like for it to be her final cry for help. She said she started to begin to shoot blindly when she saw Dan reaching for the phone. So this is where the discrepancy about when the phone was removed sort of intertwines with, was the murder premeditated or not? The prosecution stated that she removed the landline before she went in to shoot Linda and Dan so they couldn't call for help, so that would be the premeditated murder, versus the defense, which testified that she had went in to complete suicide, but when she saw Dan trying to call 911, she panicked and started shooting, and then as she fled the scene, she unplugged the phone and ran away with the phone for some reason, in just a panic. So the first trial lasted 3 weeks, and then the jury deliberated for 4 days, but it ended in a hung jury because the 12 jury members couldn't come to an unanimous agreement on what they should charge Betty with. 10 jury members wanted to charge her with murder, and then 2 wanted to charge her with manslaughter based on the premeditation or just crime of passion perspective, whichever one you take. So the trial was declared a mistrial by the judge because the jury couldn't come to an agreement. In September of 1991, a video was released to the public of Betty being dragged out of her cell by 6 officers. It is reported by jail insiders that when they left her alone in the isolation room, she defecated and then wiped her poop all over the walls just to sort of get back at them. I don't know. Betty says that this situation was an attempt for the jail to make her look bad and give more ammunition to the prosecution in her second trial. The prosecution had subpoenaed any video recording of Betty misbehaving in jail just around like a week or 2 prior to this event. So Betty said that she had done nothing wrong, and basically that jail officials had just started recording and just taken her out of her cell into isolation for no reason, just to make her look bad. It's hard to sort of lean either way for this one because they only start filming when she's like midway through being taken away, so you don't see what led up to that, so it's unclear what happened. And I don't think the jail ever gave an official reason why they were removing or why they were putting her into isolation, so it's hard to make a judgment. A few weeks later, Betty's second trial begins on October 15, 1991. The trial presents most of the same things and follows the same sequence of events as the first. So one notable difference in Betty's testimony is actually the landline removal. So it was my mistake. She hadn't actually testified about removing the landline in the first one. But in the second trial, when she took the stand, she said that she had removed the landline from the wall after murdering Dan and Linda because she was just in a rage and was just sort of destroying things afterwards. So it was just sort of in the crossfire of her after murder rage, and it wasn't premeditated. The defense tried to introduce evidence that Dan had actually tried to hire a hitman to kill Betty, but the judge refused to allow this information into the court because he said it wasn't relevant, because at the time Betty wasn't aware of Dan, that Dan was trying to hire a hitman, so it didn't have anything to do with her mental state or make her feel fear for her life because she didn't know about it. But that is so scary and so much more twisted that Dan was trying to hire a hitman and have Betty killed. It's just like both of these people are dreadful, dreadful people. After the second trial ended, the jury deliberated, and they actually almost had ended in a hung jury again because they were having difficulty agreeing on what to charge her with, whether it be first-degree murder or manslaughter. But on December 10th, 1991, the jury members agreed and they found her guilty of second-degree murder. Second-degree murder, if you don't know, basically means that you didn't go in premeditating the murder, but you went in the heat of the moment, you did intend to kill them. Whereas manslaughter is you didn't mean to kill them, but you did. And then first-degree murder is you premeditated and went there and did the act to murder that person. Her sentence was 32 years to life in prison, and she would be eligible for parole in 2011. By 1994, Betty had exhausted all her appeals after the Supreme Court refused to hear her case, and she was held at the California Institution for Women. It has been said that Betty was sort of this ideal inmate while she was in prison. While she is in prison, her 4 children have all kept in contact with her and do visit her and talk to her regularly, but the 4 children differ greatly on their perspectives on whether or not they believe their mother should remain behind bars. So it's sort of 2 against 2. So Kim and Dan Jr. don't believe that their mother should be released from jail because they both believe she still poses a danger or a risk to society because she's never shown remorse for the murders, and she continues to sort of blame Dan and Linda for what happened. In 2010, at her parole hearing, at one of her parole hearings, Dan Jr. actually testified to keep his mother in jail because he said she was, quote, hung up on justifying what she did. Her 2 other children, Lee and Rhett, believe that she doesn't pose a risk and that the only people that she wanted dead were already dead, and so that she should just be released. Lee, at the same parole hearing that Dan Jr. testified at, tested in favor of her mom being released and said that she had even set up a whole room in her house where her mother could stay when she got out of jail. Repeatedly citing Betty's lack of remorse for her crimes, she has been refused parole 3 times so far. So she was refused parole in 2010, 2011, and 2017, and she will not be eligible for parole until 2032, and at that time she will be 85. In conclusion, I think this case is an absolute mess, and I don't think there is any clear answers because you have unreliable sources on both sides. Dan was unreliable and Betty was unreliable. They both wanted to paint the other as the soul and only villain and themselves as this innocent victim, when I believe, as I've said before, they both contributed to the abusive and toxic relationship. But Betty was a violent and neurotic person. Whether or not that Dan's gaslighting and Dan's affair caused her to become like this is not so relevant to me, because she still had a choice to choose her children and not be violent and not put them in the crossfire, but she did. And I think if the roles were reversed and a man was the one antagonizing his ex-wife and her new husband, people wouldn't be so sympathetic and compassionate to that man. Betty could have taken a million different paths in life. Her life wasn't unlivable. She had a new boyfriend in Bradley, and she could have started again and just focused on her kids. I know that Dan was antagonizing her and constantly holding the kids as pawns over her head, but I don't think her only option was murder, and I think her erratic behavior and violence against Dan and Linda is what caused her not to have primary custody of her kids. I believe if she hadn't acted like that, it would have been easier for her to get custody. But on the other hand, maybe this could have been prevented. Maybe Betty's behavior could have been never happened if she had been raised differently. Her parents had raised her to be a housewife, and the only goal in her life was ingrained that she had to be a mother and she had to be a wife. She had to stay at home. So when this was taken away from her, it was extremely embarrassing for her family that she was divorced, and her mother and her father, after she started acting erratically. After she was held in the 5150, they basically wanted nothing to do with her. They never supported her and they never got her the resources. And I think that's also part of the reason why she acted or why she did what she did. I think the only true innocent victims in this whole story are the 4 children. Instead of prioritizing their children and just focusing on them, Dan and Betty were hung up on getting back at each other. So that's it for the true story behind Dirty John Season 2. I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.